Hi everybody, this is writing micro lesson number 6 on anticipating counterarguments for Honors 111 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine, and I'm Rob Glover, the instructor. So first off, what are counterarguments? Well, in argumentative writing, counterarguments simply refer to a possible argument that could be used against your thesis, so against your big overarching argument, or some aspect of your reasoning. And addressing these potential counterarguments is, in general, just a good rhetorical strategy, both in, if you're engaged in an oral argument or in your writing, and it can actually make your argument stronger. So bringing in evidence or claims that contradict yours can actually strengthen your argument overall. So how does that work? How does incorporating counterarguments make your writing more persuasive and better? So the first thing, just rhetorically speaking, a benefit of addressing counterarguments is that it shows that you're potentially interested in finding consensus or some sort of commonality with those who might disagree. So you're saying that there are these other claims and you're giving them validity by actually introducing them and addressing them. It also demonstrates what we call authorial honesty, right? So as an author, you're engaged in honesty. You're not trying to present, some sort of piece of writing that doesn't introduce the idea that there could be contradictions, there could be weaknesses in what you're saying, and you don't avoid the information which directly contradicts your ideas. You throw it out there and say, okay, yes, some people say this, and you kind of grapple with it. So rhetorically speaking, it's a good strategy, either in argumentative writing or just if you're engaged in an argument. It can also strengthen your argument, right? So you anticipate points of critique and you can actually address them at the outset and do so on your own terms. So you try to think about, what would the reader of this piece potentially see as points of weakness, and can I kind of jump out ahead of their critique and address it according to my own specifications. And it gives you a chance to demonstrate for the reader that your thesis is strong enough to withstand criticism, right? So some thesis statements, some arguments are kind of flimsy and you subject them to a little bit of critique and they crumble. But here you are demonstrating that your argument can hold up, or your reasoning can hold up. So how do we structure our integration of counterarguments into our writing? There's a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different places where we can integrate counterarguments. Basically anywhere in your essay, anywhere in your piece of writing. So you could imagine introducing a counterargument as the introduction for one's paper, right? So you're responding to a claim that says, X, and you're saying, however, actually, Y, and that is your thesis statement. So the whole piece of writing is kind of a counter response to a claim that someone else has made or a widely held idea. So that can happen right at the outset. It can also happen following the introduction and the thesis statement, and you can use it as the basis for including your evidence. So you kind of contextualize the topic for the reader, and you lay out your overarching argument, and then you say, here is a counter argument we often hear made, right? But, X, Y, Z, these are the reasons why that counter argument is flawed. It can happen later within the body of the essay. So you might kind of just step aside from the overarching argument that you're making and the evidence that you're including to address a piece of information, a piece of evidence that's potentially subject to critique. You kind of step out of the overarching narrative of the piece for just a moment, and you address that counterclaim, and then you step back in. Or you can do it in the conclusion. You can do it at the very end of the piece after you've laid out your full argument. You've put together the thesis statement, you've laid out your evidence, and you're anticipating a potential response to the full argument, and you actually address the counter argument in the conclusion to round out the piece. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can incorporate counter arguments. So what is the structure of integrating counter arguments? Well, this is what I'm going to be looking for this week in your weekly writing assignments. Although you can integrate a counter argument and respond to it virtually anywhere in the piece, the structure, the way that you do so is pretty standard. So whether you're doing this in the introduction, the conclusion, somewhere in the body, this is how we tend to do it. So I'll just lay out, there's 3 components. And as I said, the writing assignment for this week, this is what you're going to be graded on, is how well do you do these things. So the first is what we call the turn against, right? So you present a claim that challenges either your thesis statement or your argument. So it could be, perhaps someone would claim that you have a flawed assumption, or you've drawn a mistaken conclusion from the evidence that you've laid out. And there's typically transitional language that kind of signals to the reader that this is coming up. So, some might say, or while it may be argued that, or sometimes you identify the person directly. You say, this author or this researcher or this writer says X, right? So there's transitional language to set it up, and that's the first step, the turn against. And then there's generally some acknowledgement, right? So if the argument that you're introducing has some merits to it, you acknowledge those merits. And this goes back to that rhetorical strategy. So if you think of, you're in an argument with someone and you want to acknowledge that their side has some validity, or some of the things that they're saying make sense, you kind of acknowledge that, right? So you say, there are merits to this counterclaim, but you try to do so in a way that doesn't undermine your thesis or the argument, the thing that you're going to come back to and try to defend. So you figure out what is it in that counter argument that you could potentially agree with. And then there's the turn back, the third step. And that's the point in which you refute the counter argument in the most powerful way that you can. So you say it's mistaken, it's unimportant, it's overblown, they're exaggerating. And here too, there's transitional language. So words like however, or nevertheless, or despite this, or in actuality. That's how you signal to the reader that you're turning back and you're going to try to refute that counter argument. So here's an example. This is a hypothetical argument that could be made about one of the texts that you've read, and a very controversial and provocative thesis, right? But if you go back to the Torah, you think about the Torah a little bit, the thesis statement for this paper would be as follows. The Torah represents a vision of justice as retribution, one that is ill-equipped to serve as a basis for modern legal and social institutions, right? So this person is critically analyzing the Torah and saying that the vision of justice is focused on retribution, revenge, getting back at people who have wronged you. And so it's not a good fit for modern legal and social institutions. So you could imagine writing an entire essay, either a weekly essay or a longer essay around that thesis statement. And this is what the integration of a counter-argument would look like. So this refers actually to a quote that Pope Francis made in relation to the Torah in a meeting with Jewish spiritual leaders, right? Kind of an interfaith meeting. So I'll just read through it. Note that as I read it, right, we'll go back to this 3-pronged approach here. The turn against, the acknowledgement, and the turn back here are in different colors. So the purple is the turn against. The orange is the acknowledgement, and then the turn back to refute the counterclaim is in green, right? So I'll read through it. Keep in mind kind of the architecture of how you integrate counter arguments as I read through this. Recently, Pope Francis argued that the Torah actually represents a, quote, paternal and visceral love of God, a love shown in words and concrete gestures, a love that becomes covenant. And there's a quotation from Harris, 2017. The text certainly demonstrates God's tenacious commitment to the protection of the Israelites. However, it is a love not for humanity as a whole, but solely for the Israelites. And he so often acts upon that love by inflicting pain and punishment, retribution for mistreatment of his chosen people. Moses even needs to intervene to prevent God from completely wiping out the Israelites, who have temporarily gone astray. The Torah provides us with a volatile, vindictive, and selective form of justice, one that is not an effective model for how diverse societies can live together in peace and harmony. So there we have the introduction of a counter-argument. This quote from Pope Francis would seem to suggest that no, actually, there's, the Torah can represent a more loving, compassionate basis for justice. And in the orange there, you have agreement. You say, yeah, the text demonstrates that God has a commitment to and a protection of, and presumably a love of, the Israelites. And then you have a number of sentences, I guess 3 sentences, that go into detail to try to refute Pope Francis, to try to come back and say, no, that's not accurate. It's a selective love. It's not a love for humanity. It's only a love for a chosen people, and therefore it can't be a model for human justice for an entire society or the whole world. So that would be an example of what this looks like in an essay. And you've probably done this in some respect, whether you've been as intentional and systematic as this or not. You've probably had to integrate a counter-argument and a response to a counter-argument at some point in your writing. So there is some additional guidance on this for those of you that are looking for a little bit more help. Harvard University's Writing Center, which is a good general resource. I know most of these I'm usually talking about Purdue and the online writing lab, but Harvard University's Writing Center is great as well. This page has a focus strictly on the counter-argument. And then Grossmont College has a good kind of run-through of counter-argument and what they call refutation, essentially that turn back, right, where you go and try to refute the counter-argument. So these are good resources as well. So just a reminder that for this week, the thing that I will be focused on in your weekly writing assignments is this three-pronged structure of how we integrate counter-arguments and respond to them. And that's it. I look forward to reading your writing assignments for this week. Thanks very much.